The wealthy cowboy could have driven her out. What he did instead shocked the valley. The valley of Silver Creek was a place where the seasons dictated life. Summers were long and warm, painting the hills in golden hues, while winters were harsh, turning the streams to ice and the fields to white blankets. For generations, families had lived here, raising cattle, growing crops, and relying on each other in ways that only a small, close-knit community could understand. Everyone knew everyone, and news traveled quickly, often before a letter or phone call could arrive. It was a place where whispers held power, and reputations meant everything. When Alina Hayes arrived in Silver Creek, she carried with her a quiet determination and a past she kept carefully hidden. She was not a native of the valley, nor had she grown up among the rolling hills and wide-open pastures. Instead, she had lived in bustling towns, in apartments with more walls than windows, surrounded by the noise of cars and people and never enough fresh air. That life had taught her resilience, but it had also left her longing for something different, a place where she could breathe, think, and make her own mark on the world. Her small, run-down homestead was at the very edge of Clayton Moore's sprawling ranch, which dominated the eastern side of Silver Creek. The Moore Ranch was legendary in the valley, not just for its size, but for the wealth and influence of its owner. Clayton Moore had inherited the ranch from his father and had expanded it carefully over the years, buying neighboring land whenever it became available. Rumors about him were common. Some said he was generous, others whispered he could be cold and unforgiving if crossed. For a newcomer like Alina, buying land so close to him was a bold move. From the moment she arrived, the valley seemed to hold its breath. Neighbors watched as a small figure unloaded furniture, tools, and boxes from her old pickup truck. Alina moved with purpose, even when her muscles ached from lifting heavy crates or when the wind blew cold dust into her eyes. She had decided to live simply, to work hard, and to carve out a place of her own, but it quickly became clear that living so close to someone like Clayton Moore would not go unnoticed. Children on bicycles slowed as they passed by her property, their eyes wide as they whispered to each other. Farmers on tractors tipped their hats but kept their distance. The older women of the valley shook their heads in quiet curiosity, discussing in low tones the audacity of a stranger setting roots so close to the man who owned nearly half the valley. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone wondered the same thing. Would Clayton Moore let her stay? Or would he force her off the land as he had done to others who tried to make their mark too close to his ranch? Alina ignored the whispers. She had learned long ago that people would talk, no matter what you did, and that worrying about rumors wasted time better spent on real work. Still, she could not ignore the feeling of being watched. On the first night, as she lit a small lantern and unpacked her belongings, she noticed lights from the Moore Ranch shining in the distance. The ranch was enormous, and its fences seemed to stretch forever. The sight of the sprawling property was intimidating, but instead of fear, Alina felt a strange sense of determination. She had not come here to shrink back from a challenge. She had come to build a life, and she would do it on her own terms. Her first days in Silver Creek were filled with labor. The homestead was old, with peeling paint and a roof that leaked in places. The garden she had imagined was nothing but hard soil, cracked and dry from years of neglect. She fixed the fences, repaired the windows, and cleaned the barn that had once been full of animals but now smelled of dust and old hay. Every task was exhausting, but it was also deeply satisfying. Each improvement was a small victory, a tangible proof that she could turn the place into something that felt like home. Word of her hard work spread. Some of the neighbors admired her courage, though they rarely came close. They whispered behind fences and in grocery stores, debating whether she would last through the harsh winter, whether she could handle the hard life of the valley. Alina could hear fragments of these conversations from time to time, and instead of discouraging her, they only strengthened her resolve. She knew that staying strong was not just about surviving. It was about showing the valley that she belonged there. The contrast between Alina's modest homestead and Clayton Moore's luxurious ranch could not have been more obvious. While she struggled with old tools and a leaky roof, Clayton's land boasted new fences, perfectly tended pastures, and a large, modern barn filled with healthy cattle. Rumors about Clayton's wealth circulated freely, and Alina had heard stories from the neighbors. How he had once expanded his land by quietly buying properties from families who could not keep up, and how some had left the valley entirely. The thought could have been intimidating, but Alina did not let it scare her. She respected the man's success but refused to believe that her dreams would be crushed by it. Evenings were the hardest. The valley was quiet at night, and the wind swept through the hills carrying a loneliness that made her doubt herself. She would sit by the window, lantern glowing, and imagine how the life she wanted could grow from the hard work she had started. Sometimes she caught glimpses of Clayton Moore riding across his land on horseback, the sun setting behind him. He seemed like a figure from another world, strong, untouchable, and completely in control. She wondered what he thought of her, whether he had noticed the small homestead taking shape at the edge of his domain. One morning, Alina woke to find tracks in the soft mud near her garden. She traced them carefully and realized they came from the Moore ranch. The presence was unnerving, but curiosity outweighed fear. She wondered whether Clayton had come to assess her work, to judge whether she would be a nuisance or an ally. In a valley where everyone knew everyone, such visits were never accidental. Her heart pounded as she prepared herself to face him, should he appear at her door. Life in Silver Creek was teaching Alina lessons she had never learned in the city. She discovered the rhythm of the land, how to read the weather by the clouds, how to mend fences so they lasted for years, how to plant seeds so they thrived despite the harsh soil. She learned patience and persistence, realizing that success in this valley was not given. It was earned through sweat, careful thought, and respect for the land. Each day brought new challenges, but also small triumphs that kept her motivated. Neighbors began to notice her determination. Some, initially skeptical, were quietly impressed. Farmers who had once doubted her ability to survive in the valley nodded as they passed by, and even a few of the older ranchers offered subtle advice, tips for fixing broken tools or tending to crops. Alina listened politely, grateful for any guidance, but she always did the work herself. She wanted to build something that was truly hers, and she refused to rely on anyone else to shape her future. Even with all the work, Alina never let herself feel isolated. She spoke to the valley when she could, learning names and faces, absorbing stories of generations who had lived and struggled here. Every conversation added to her sense of belonging, even if some residents remained cautious. She began to understand the unwritten rules of the valley, the way respect was earned not by wealth, but by character and effort. And though Clayton Moore remained a looming figure on the horizon, Alina began to feel that she had carved a place for herself where he could not simply push her aside. The first part of Alina's story in Silver Creek was one of survival, discovery, and quiet courage. She faced skepticism, isolation, and the weight of a world very different from the one she had left behind. Yet through it all, she moved forward, determined to make the valley her home, brick by brick, fence post by fence post. And though the residents whispered and the wind carried uncertainty, Alina's determination remained steadfast. Little did she know, the man whose land towered beside hers, the wealthy cowboy who could have easily driven her out, was already taking notice. But how he would respond to her presence would be a story that would shock the valley in ways no one could have predicted. Life in Silver Creek was not easy, but Alina Hayes faced each day with determination. The valley had a rhythm of its own, and she was slowly learning to move with it. The mornings were the busiest. She woke before sunrise, the first light barely brushing the hills, and stepped outside to assess what needed to be done. Sometimes it was repairing a broken fence, other times tending to the small vegetable garden that was beginning to flourish despite the rough soil. Each task required strength, patience, and a careful eye. She had never worked like this before in her life, and the fatigue she felt at the end of the day was unlike anything she had ever known. Yet, there was a satisfaction in it that no city job had ever given her. Even as she worked, Alina felt the constant weight of being watched. It was subtle at first, a shadow moving across the field, the sound of hooves on the dirt road. But gradually she realized that someone from the Moore ranch was keeping an eye on her. Clayton Moore. The thought sent shivers through her the first few times she noticed him. He was a man who commanded respect simply by existing. Stories of his wealth, influence, and sometimes cold decisions had reached her ears before she even arrived. And now, it seemed, she was on the edge of his world, a small figure building something that, on paper, could easily have been claimed by him. The valley's residents talked about it quietly. Some of the older men leaned against fences and speculated whether Alina would last the winter, whether Clayton would decide she was too close to his land. The women whispered in the grocery store about how bold it was for her to try to create a home so near a man who controlled so much of the valley. Children slowed their bicycles when passing her homestead, peering curiously through the gate. All this attention made Alina uneasy at first, but she quickly learned to focus on what she could control, her work and her determination. Then, one afternoon, it happened. Alina was repairing a section of fence near the edge of her property, struggling with a stubborn post that refused to go straight. The sun was high, making the work hotter and more exhausting than usual. She heard the soft sound of hooves before she saw him, and then Clayton Moore appeared. He was on horseback, the sleek black horse moving easily over the uneven terrain. Clayton himself was a striking figure, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hat that shaded his face and boots that spoke of both style and utility. Alina froze for a moment. She had wondered what an encounter would be like, but she had not expected it so soon, and certainly not like this. Clayton dismounted with a practiced ease, his eyes scanning the fence post she was wrestling with. "That looks tricky," he said, his voice calm but firm. Alina wiped the sweat from her forehead and tried to appear confident, though her hands were sore and her heart was racing. "It is," she admitted. "This post just won't stay straight." Clayton nodded, surveying the fence line. He didn't move closer at first, and she noticed the way he measured the property, as if calculating boundaries in his mind. The valley held its breath. If he wanted, he could make a case that she was on his land, that she had no right to be here. Stories of his past dealings made such thoughts real, but instead he said something that surprised her. "You're doing a good job with this place. It's not easy, but you're making it work." Alina blinked. She had expected criticism, perhaps even a veiled threat. Praise was not something she had anticipated from a man like Clayton Moore. "Thank you," she said cautiously. "It's not perfect, but I'm trying." Clayton smiled faintly, then leaned on the fence. He asked a few practical questions about her work, where she sourced her tools, how she planned to manage water for the garden, whether she had help for the heavy lifting. Alina answered honestly. She had no one helping her, and much of the work fell on her own shoulders. Clayton listened, occasionally nodding, sometimes offering a suggestion, but always respectful, never imposing. That first encounter set the tone for what would come next. Over the following weeks, Clayton continued to observe her from a distance. Sometimes he appeared at the edge of her property, offering advice on a particularly tricky repair or a suggestion for planting that would help the soil. Other times, he simply watched quietly, allowing her to make her own choices. The townspeople speculated endlessly about what this meant. Was he testing her, considering whether to drive her out, or was there something else at work entirely? Alina, for her part, tried to focus on her work and ignore the speculation. Yet she could not help noticing the change in the way the valley reacted. Neighbors who had been distant began to nod in acknowledgement when passing by. A few offered small pieces of help, a spare bag of fertilizer, a broken rake that could be fixed, advice about the best way to mend fences. It was clear that the presence of Clayton Moore had a ripple effect. His reputation alone commanded attention, and his subtle approval, though rarely spoken aloud, began to shift the valley's perception of Alina. The work itself was relentless. Mornings blurred into afternoons as Alina repaired fences, cleared brush, and tended to the small garden that was beginning to take shape. She discovered the details that made the land difficult to manage, the soil that dried too quickly, the water supply that needed careful planning, and the wild animals that sometimes made unexpected visits. Each problem required patience and problem-solving, and she faced them with a mix of determination and stubbornness. The labor was exhausting, but the reward was tangible. Each repaired fence, each sprouting plant was proof that she was capable, that she belonged in this valley. Meanwhile, Clayton's subtle presence continued to influence events. One morning, Alina woke to find a few more fence posts had been replaced overnight. At first, she thought it might have been a neighbor, but the neat, precise work suggested otherwise. She later learned from a passing ranch hand that Clayton had quietly provided some assistance, ensuring that the work was safe and would last through the winter. He did not interfere directly, but his support was there, invisible but effective. The valley continued to watch, fascinated by this strange dynamic. People whispered about the wealthy cowboy who could have driven the newcomer off her land, but had instead chosen to watch, to allow her to grow, to intervene only when necessary. Some were skeptical, expecting this benevolence to have a limit. Others admired the quiet wisdom of Clayton's approach. Elena remained largely unaware of the full extent of the valley's attention, focused as she was on her work and the slow transformation of her homestead. Winter approached, bringing with it the harshest challenges yet. Snow covered the ground, turning the valley into a frozen landscape. Elena faced icy winds, frozen water lines, and the constant threat of her small homestead being damaged by the cold. Each day became a test of endurance. She worked tirelessly, often rising before dawn and continuing until the last light faded from the horizon. Despite the physical challenges, she felt a deep satisfaction in her perseverance. She was learning not just to survive, but to thrive even in conditions that were unforgiving. Through it all, Clayton remained a silent presence. He occasionally rode past, checking on her property, offering a word of advice, or helping with particularly difficult tasks. Yet he never intruded. He respected her independence, even as he ensured she would not be overwhelmed by the harsh realities of the valley. This balance of support and distance created a sense of trust between them, though neither spoke of it directly. By the time the snow began to melt, Elena's homestead had transformed. The fences were sturdy, the garden was healthy, and the house, though still modest, was repaired and welcoming. She had proven to herself that she could survive and thrive in Silver Creek. The valley had noticed, too. Respect replaced curiosity and skepticism. People who had once doubted her now offered nods of approval, smiles, and occasional help. The story of the determined newcomer spreading roots near the Moore Ranch became a quiet legend of its own. And through it all, the question remained, why had Clayton Moore chosen this path? The valley had expected conflict, yet he had done the unexpected. Elena's presence, once a potential source of tension, had become a story of resilience, quiet wisdom, and respect. What had started as an uncertain and tense situation was slowly unfolding into something that no one in Silver Creek could have predicted. Elena Hayes, once a stranger in a strange land, was becoming a part of the valley's story, not because of her wealth or connections, but because of her courage, her work ethic, and her determination. And Clayton Moore, the wealthy cowboy whose reputation preceded him, was beginning to show that true strength was not always about dominance. It could also be about patience, observation, and the quiet support that allowed someone else to succeed. Spring arrived in Silver Creek with a gentle warmth that softened the harsh edges of winter. The snow melted slowly from the hills, revealing patches of green grass that had been hidden for months. Elena Hayes stepped outside her homestead one morning and felt the sunlight on her face, a lightness she had not experienced in years. Her garden was beginning to show signs of life, tiny green shoots pushing through the soil she had worked so hard to prepare. The fences were sturdy now, standing tall against the winds that had once threatened to topple them. For the first time, she allowed herself a small moment of pride. The valley had begun to take notice in a quiet but unmistakable way. Neighbors who had been skeptical were now offering nods and smiles, sometimes stopping briefly to admire her progress. Children waved as they rode past on bicycles, and even the older ranchers nodded approvingly when they passed by her gates. Elena had become part of the fabric of Silver Creek, not by demanding attention, but by earning it through determination and hard work. Yet there was still one person whose opinion mattered most, and whose actions remained unpredictable: Clayton Moore. Clayton watched from a distance as he often did, his presence known but unobtrusive. He saw Elena moving through her day, tending the garden, repairing fences, and clearing brush, all with a tireless energy that impressed him. He had expected a newcomer to falter under the weight of the valley's demands, but Elena had proved otherwise. She did not just survive. She adapted, learned, and began to thrive. Clayton felt a mixture of curiosity and admiration, though he never let it show openly. In the valley, respect was earned quietly, and he knew that his next actions could have a lasting impact. The turning point came one afternoon when Elena faced a problem too large to handle alone. A section of the old barn roof had weakened during the winter and threatened to collapse under the spring rains. Elena tried to fix it herself, climbing onto the roof with hammer and nails, but the boards were rotten, and the task became increasingly dangerous. She realized that if she continued alone, she might injure herself or fail completely. For the first time, she felt a pang of fear, fear that months of hard work could be undone in a single moment. As she stood on the roof, assessing the damage, a familiar shadow appeared at the edge of the property. Clayton Moore rode in quietly, the black horse moving with practiced grace over the uneven ground. Eleanor's heart sank for a moment, unsure of his intentions. She had become accustomed to his distant presence, but a sudden, direct approach brought uncertainty. Was he here to confront her, or was something else at play? Clayton dismounted and approached the barn with careful steps. He surveyed the roof with a trained eye, noting the weakened beams and the unstable boards. Then in a calm but commanding voice he said, "You shouldn't do this alone, it's dangerous, let me help." Eleanor hesitated. Pride and independence warred with common sense. She had faced countless challenges alone, but this task was different. The roof was too large, the boards too rotten, and the risk too high. She nodded reluctantly. "Okay," she admitted, her voice tight with tension. "I could use some help." What happened next surprised the valley more than anything they had imagined. Clayton didn't take over and do the work for her, nor did he lecture her on her safety. Instead, he worked alongside her, shoulder to shoulder, offering guidance and steady hands. He lifted heavy beams, nailed boards in place, and showed Eleanor techniques to strengthen the roof. She followed his instructions carefully, learning new skills even as they worked together. The barn gradually transformed from a dangerous hazard into a safe and sturdy structure, standing as a testament to their combined effort. The neighbors who watched from a distance were stunned. They had expected confrontation, perhaps even intimidation, from the wealthy cowboy. Instead, they saw collaboration, patience, and respect. Clayton Moore, the man who could have driven Eleanor out, had chosen to support her, not dominate her. The sight sparked quiet conversations throughout the valley. People whispered about the unexpected kindness, about the courage of the newcomer, and about how sometimes strength was not measured by wealth or power, but by the ability to lift others up. Over the following weeks, Clayton continued to assist in subtle ways. He provided materials Eleanor could not afford, such as quality lumber and nails, and sometimes sent ranch hands to help with heavy lifting or repairs she could not manage alone. Yet he never interfered with her decisions. He respected her ownership, her independence, and her determination to create something truly hers. Eleanor, in turn, accepted the help with humility, grateful but careful not to let it diminish her sense of accomplishment. The relationship between them grew quietly, built on trust, respect, and shared work. Eleanor began to see a side of Clayton Moore that few others witnessed. He was not just a wealthy rancher. He was a man who understood the land, the hardships of work, and the value of persistence. He did not flaunt his wealth, nor did he seek recognition for his assistance. His presence was steady, reliable, and reassuring, a constant in a world that had once seemed overwhelming. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Eleanor and Clayton sat outside the barn, wiping sweat from their brows and watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. For the first time, Eleanor spoke about her past, about the life she had left behind in the city, about the dreams that had brought her to Silver Creek. Clayton listened quietly, offering few words but full attention. She realized then that their bond was not just about work. It was about understanding, respect, and a shared appreciation for the land they both cared about deeply. The valley began to notice more than just the barn repairs. They saw the transformation of Eleanor's property, the garden thriving, the fences strong, and the homestead becoming a welcoming place that reflected care and effort. People who had been skeptical or distant began to approach, offering small gestures of kindness and occasional advice. The story of the wealthy cowboy and the determined newcomer spread through the community, becoming a source of inspiration and conversation. Then came a moment that would truly shock the valley. A storm hit Silver Creek, fierce and sudden, with high winds and heavy rain. Trees bent dangerously, and the newly repaired barn roof faced a severe test. Eleanor worked tirelessly to secure the property, but the storm was relentless. Just when it seemed the roof might fail, Clayton appeared, riding through the rain without hesitation. Together, they reinforced the structure, holding it steady against the winds until the worst of the storm passed. The townspeople who witnessed this were astonished. The man who could have driven her off the land had risked himself to ensure her safety. The story spread quickly. Not only had Clayton Moore helped Alina Hayes, but he had done so during a storm that could have caused serious damage or injury. It was an act of courage and generosity that no one in Silver Creek would forget. After the storm, the valley's perception of both Alina and Clayton changed. Alina was admired for her resilience, determination, and skill, while Clayton was respected not just for his wealth, but for his character. The partnership they had formed became a model of how strength could be used to support, rather than dominate. Their story was no longer just about a newcomer and a wealthy rancher. It was about trust, respect, and the power of unexpected kindness. In the weeks that followed, Alina's homestead flourished more than ever. The garden produced abundant vegetables, the barn was stronger than it had been in years, and the fences held steady against animals and weather alike. Clayton continued to offer help when needed, always carefully balanced so that Alina's independence remained intact. Their collaboration became seamless, a quiet partnership built on shared goals, mutual respect, and the understanding that each person's contribution mattered equally. The valley, which had once expected conflict, now marveled at the scene. They saw two people working together, not out of obligation or interest in wealth, but because they recognized each other's effort and worth. Children playing near Alina's homestead waved at Clayton without fear. Neighbors stopped by with greetings and offers of help, and the story of their cooperation spread beyond Silver Creek. It became a symbol of what could be achieved when pride, power, and independence were balanced with respect, patience, and generosity. By the end of Part 3, the story of Alina Hayes and Clayton Moore had reached its peak. The barn stood as a symbol of their joint effort. The homestead reflected months of labor and care, and the valley had witnessed something extraordinary. A wealthy man who could have driven a newcomer out chose instead to support her, teaching everyone a lesson in courage, humility, and community. The stage was set for the final chapter, where the true impact of their actions would resonate, leaving a legacy that the valley would spring had fully arrived in Silver Creek, bringing warmth, gentle breezes, and the promise of new beginnings. Alina Hayes stood at the edge of her homestead, looking across the valley she had slowly made her own. The garden was lush and full of life, the fences sturdy, and the barn standing tall, stronger than it had been in years. Each improvement was the result of months of tireless effort, often alone, but sometimes with the quiet support of Clayton Moore. She could see the fruits of her labor all around her, and for the first time she felt a deep sense of belonging. The valley, too, had changed. Neighbors who had once been skeptical or distant now greeted her warmly. Farmers passing on their tractors waved as they drove by. Children shouted cheerful greetings while riding their bicycles near the homestead, and even the older ranchers offered nods of respect. Alina's presence had transformed from a point of curiosity and doubt into a source of admiration. People now spoke of her courage, resilience, and determination. But more than that, they spoke of the way she had formed an unexpected bond with Clayton Moore, the man whose wealth and influence could have easily overshadowed her. Clayton himself continued to be a constant yet unobtrusive presence. He rarely imposed, rarely offered more help than necessary, and always allowed Alina to make her own choices. But the quiet support he provided was evident in every stable fence post, every healthy plant in the garden, and every repaired section of the barn. In a way, their partnership had become a balance of independence and cooperation, a delicate understanding built on mutual respect. It was during one late afternoon that the valley witnessed a moment that would be remembered for years to come. Alina had planned a small gathering, inviting neighbors who had supported her quietly, and those who had been curious observers of her progress. She wanted to celebrate the completion of the barn repairs and the transformation of her homestead, but more than that, she wanted to acknowledge the community that had quietly shaped her journey. The attendees arrived slowly, some on foot, others in tractors or wagons, bringing small gifts, baskets of fresh eggs, home-baked bread, and jars of preserves. There was laughter in the air, children playing near the garden, and the smell of fresh earth and wildflowers blending with the warmth of the sun. Alina stood near the barn, a modest smile on her face, grateful for the turnout. She was about to speak when Clayton Moore appeared, riding his horse in a way that commanded attention without arrogance. The crowd hushed as he dismounted. People had long speculated about his intentions toward Alina, wondering whether he would claim authority over her land or simply continue to observe from a distance. Now, standing before them, he spoke with a calm, steady voice. This valley has a long history of hard work, respect, and community. Eleanor has shown us all what determination and courage look like. She has not only built a home here, but has earned a place in the heart of Silver Creek. There was a pause, and a murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Clayton continued, "I could have done many things when she first arrived. I could have challenged her, discouraged her, or even forced her to leave. But that would not have been right. Instead, I chose to help when it was needed and to let her prove her own strength. And today, we see the result." Eleanor felt a rush of emotion. She had worked tirelessly, often questioning whether she could continue. And yet here she was, not just surviving but thriving, with the community acknowledging her efforts and Clayton standing beside her in quiet support. She spoke next, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I came here seeking a chance to build a life, not knowing if I would succeed or be accepted. Thanks to the people of Silver Creek, and especially to Clayton, I have found a home. A place where hard work is respected, where kindness and patience can change lives, and where one person's support can make a world of difference." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing through the valley. Neighbors came forward to shake hands, offer hugs, and share stories of their own struggles and triumphs. Children ran through the garden, laughing as they played hide-and-seek among the newly planted flowers. Even the older ranchers, who had once questioned Eleanor's decision to settle here, nodded with quiet approval. It was a moment of unity, celebration, and mutual respect that reflected the essence of life in Silver Creek. In the days that followed, Eleanor's homestead became a symbol of possibility and hope in the valley. Visitors from nearby towns came to see the transformation, curious about the woman who had arrived alone and the wealthy cowboy who had chosen to help rather than intimidate. Stories were told in the general store, at church gatherings, and around dinner tables about Eleanor's determination, Clayton's unexpected generosity, and the partnership that had grown from mutual respect rather than power or wealth. Clayton's actions had also changed the perception of leadership in the valley. People began to see that true strength was not measured by dominance or fear, but by the ability to recognize potential in others and support it when it mattered most. His example inspired other ranchers and community members to act with patience and thoughtfulness, creating a ripple effect of kindness and collaboration that strengthened the bonds within Silver Creek. Eleanor herself continued her daily work, now with a sense of purpose that went beyond survival. She experimented with new crops, tended the garden with skill and care, and maintained the barn and fences with pride. She found joy in the small victories, the first sprouting of seeds, the repair of a stubborn fence, or the successful harvest of vegetables. Each task reminded her of how far she had come, from the lonely arrival of a stranger in the valley to being an accepted and respected member of the community. Her relationship with Clayton also evolved. While they had always worked well together, they began to share more of their thoughts, dreams, and experiences. They spoke about the history of the valley, the challenges of ranch life, and the small joys that made the work meaningful. There was a mutual understanding and trust that did not require constant words or gestures. Their bond had become a quiet partnership, built on respect, admiration, and shared values. As the seasons changed once more, Eleanor looked around her property with a sense of accomplishment and peace. The homestead, once dilapidated and lonely, now thrived. Flowers bloomed in the garden, vegetables filled baskets, and the barn stood as a sturdy shelter for tools and animals. The fences, once weak and broken, now marked the boundaries of her land with strength and care. Every improvement reflected her hard work, her determination, and the support of a community that had come to respect and admire her. The valley, too, had changed. The story of Eleanor Hayes and Clayton Moore became a lesson in courage, resilience, and the power of kindness. It was a story told and retold, inspiring newcomers and reminding longtime residents that success was not only about wealth or power, but also about integrity, patience, and the willingness to lift others up. People in Silver Creek began to approach challenges with a renewed sense of cooperation, inspired by the example set by the unlikely partnership that had blossomed at the edge of the Moore Ranch. Eleanor also discovered the deeper joys of community life. She helped neighbors with repairs, shared her harvest with those in need, and offered guidance to newcomers who sought to establish themselves in the valley. She had become a source of inspiration, showing that determination, hard work, and humility could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. Her presence encouraged others to try, to persevere, and to believe that they too could shape their lives and the world around them. One warm summer evening, Alina and Clayton stood together at the edge of the valley, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange, pink, and gold. Alina reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from the uncertainty of her arrival to the challenges of winter, the moments of fear and doubt, and finally, the triumph of creating a home and earning the respect of the valley. Clayton stood silently beside her, a steady and reassuring presence. Neither needed words. Their shared experiences and the trust they had built spoke more powerfully than any speech could. The valley, which had once been filled with whispers of doubt and speculation, now echoed with stories of hope and inspiration. Alina's journey became a symbol of courage and determination, while Clayton's choices demonstrated the strength of quiet generosity and patience. Together, they had changed not only the homestead, but also the hearts and minds of those around them. Silver Creek had witnessed something rare and remarkable, a story of resilience, collaboration, and the transformative power of kindness. By the end of that summer, Alina Hayes had not only found a home in Silver Creek, but she had also found her place in the community and in the valley's history. The homestead thrived, the barn stood strong, and the fences marked the boundaries of a life built with hard work, patience, and respect. Clayton Moore's actions had left an indelible mark on the valley, showing that wealth and power could be used to uplift rather than dominate. And for the residents of Silver Creek, the story of the wealthy cowboy and the determined newcomer would be remembered for generations as a tale of courage, generosity, and the enduring spirit of community.